Okay, so that's the sign. So a very warm welcome for today's MLO seminar, and I'm really pleased that we have our colleague Dan Ozarow presenting today, who has published a couple of books, and I wanted to ask him to share. I asked him to share his experience of publishing a book with us, because this is something that we might want to do in the future, or some of us have done it and may have their own experience of what it is like to publish a book. So I'm looking forward to this really, what I think will be a really interesting session. And there will be, Dan told me he will talk for maybe 20-25 minutes, so there will be plenty of time to share experiences, to ask questions, and so on. So again, a very warm welcome to all, a very warm welcome to Dan, and I'm going to hand over to Dan straight away.
Thanks, Andrea. I'm just going to put the slides up here. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see that, and hopefully everyone can hear me as well. And I just want to start off by thanking Andrea for the invitation to speak today. And I suppose the other kind of thing I want to say is that, you know, I feel like I'm in the presence of giants here. I mean, there are people that I can see that have joined us who have probably published more than me, published more books than me, and so on. So I'm no kind of, you know, oracle, but I think what I want to try and do in this session is explain kind of two main things, really. One, describe my own experiences of having published 3 books, 1 monograph and 2 edited books in 3 different countries. And then the second thing is to talk a bit about the process as well, because I'm also aware that there are colleagues here or colleagues who may want to watch the recording, especially PhD students who may never have published a book before, a monograph, but are thinking about doing so. So what I want to say, I guess, is that when we come to kind of questions or contributions at the end, I'm sure that all of us who have published books have had very different experiences, hopefully positive experiences in the main, but I can learn from you just as much as you know, you can learn from me today. So yeah, what I kind of going to start off, this is kind of what we're going to be looking at today. So I'm going to start off just by explaining a little bit about who I am. I think most of you know me, but a bit about kind of my publishing experience, and particularly the 3 books that I've published. And then asking ourselves questions about, you know, why publish an academic monograph? Because I think a lot of people, well, some people publish monographs for the wrong reasons. Some people don't understand quite how much work it's going to be to start with. You know, there are plenty of alternatives to it, but then equally, obviously, it's a really rewarding experience for those of us who have gone through it. So I just want to look at kind of some of the pros and cons of publishing a monograph, you know, so that we're more aware, I guess, of those things that I don't think really I was aware of when I published my first edited book. I think by the time I published a monograph, which is last year, I think I was a bit more aware, but still. Then I do want to kind of give a bit of focus to the turning your PhD into a monograph kind of scenario. That's what happened to me, but in my experience, I actually, my Viva was in 2013, but I only published my monograph last year, so it was 6 years later, largely because I kind of left it for quite a long time, because the kind of pressures of academia took over, and it wasn't a priority for me at that time. But yeah, anyway, so just kind of talking about how they're obviously very different things, okay? But there are some similarities too, so I'm going to talk through a bit of those. Kind of a lot of people also don't realise just how long it will take, the whole process from start to finish. And you have to be very much, when you decide that you're going to kind of publish a monograph, I think you've very much got to kind of have like perhaps a 3-year plan, you know, and almost choose a time in your life where there are no big events happening. You know, you're not about to get married, or you're not about to have kids, or whatever it might be. Now, you can do it. Of course, people can do it and have done it with all kinds of things. I mean, life, who would have predicted what we have to go through at the moment collectively, even, you know, as little as a year ago. But it just makes things easier if you can try and foresee those events ahead. So yeah, and then you know, choosing a publisher, how do you choose them? What kind of things do you consider? I remember before I published my monograph, I remember having a conversation with Anne Will about kind of whether I should go for a kind of low grade, almost Mickey Mouse publisher and just get something done quickly, or whether I should try and pitch to some of the best academic or most renowned academic publishers out there. And I think in the end she advised me to go for the second option, and I'm really pleased I did. But I'm going to explain some of the choices that need to be made at that point. And then just kind of to finish off with some of the kind of practical issues, you know, the peer review process, what goes on, what happens when you sign a contract. Is it straightforward? Do you have to accept what's put before you on the table, or can you negotiate? And you know, it does very much depend on your own circumstance and the publisher's willingness to negotiate, but we'll talk through that a bit. Then the publishing process. Promoting a book is something that I really pushed hard on a lot for all 3 books, and I'm going to describe some of the things that I did and some of the things that are that have kind of more traditionally done as well. And then, as I say at the end, and as Andrea said earlier, you know, let's try and have some discussion about this and also share our own experiences too. So a bit about me. I think I know everyone here anyway, but I've been I'm a senior lecturer here at Middlesex. I actually started my PhD here 2008, I think it was, and then I started as an hourly paid lecturer in 2012, and have been here ever since on a kind of full-time basis. Yeah, as I say, that's me and my wife on the day that I had my Viva. I remember it was a day in August. It was a nice sunny hot day, and as you can imagine, the university is pretty much closed. There's hardly anyone around in August, and there's always going to be students in the PhD office. But I just remember kind of having a bit of an anticlimactic feel at the end, because I'd just done my Viva. I passed. I was lucky enough to pass with no corrections. And then I was like, well, who do I celebrate with? And my wife came along and surprised me, which was lovely. But then I was like, well, where do I go now? So my automatic instinct was to go to the PhD office. I'm sure that happens with a lot of us who pass our PhD. There were only 3 or 4 students in there, and it was lovely to celebrate with them. But I don't think I tipped anyone off beforehand because I was nervous that I might not pass it. But anyway, I'm sure we all have our own stories to tell about. I think I remember my contact lens fell out before I did my Viva or something. We've probably all got funny stories to tell. Anyway, so I've published 3 books. I've got them in my hand as we speak. All very different experiences, actually. So the first one was with Palgrave Macmillan, called Argentina Since the 2001 Crisis. And that was an edited book that came off the back of a academic conference that I convened at University of London as a PhD student. That was around 2011, and this got published in 2014. And the publisher was UK based. Then in 2016, I did a book in Spanish. This is another edited book called De la crisis de 2001 al kirchnerismo. And this was a Prometeo, which is one of the leading Latin American publishers as well. Again, a very, very different experience. I'll probably talk about that a bit more later, but the publisher was very much more laid back. They published, because it came out in paperback immediately, and it was much cheaper. And I think they did an initial print run of 1,000, whereas Palgrave did an initial print run of, I think, 200. But it was a much more kind of accessible book. So it was sold in bookshops all up down the high street, as opposed to just in kind of university libraries or that kind of thing. So the publisher really had a quite a hands-off approach, and I think it was mainly because they were much less kind of picky with the kind of, you know, books that they wanted to, that they were kind of selling. So they probably got kind of much more, had less time probably to be communicating with us constantly. Plus, of course, we had the distance difference and everything else like that. And then the third book was my first monograph, which came out last year, The Mobilisation and Demobilisation of Middle Class Revolt, and that's published with Routledge. I think the book I'm probably most proud of because it's a monograph, and also because I basically I started researching this book in 2004 because it was what we call a life's work. I remember I had this conversation with Tim last year. He was like, "Tell me about your plans to publish the book." Then I was like, "Well, Tim, it's my life's work. I have to get it published." A couple of years ago, Tim and I had that conversation. But no, because basically I started out my interest in the middle class, and in particular the impoverished middle class, and how they respond to economic crises in terms of their consumer responses, business responses, entrepreneurial responses, and political responses. Started off when I volunteered with the impoverished middle class over in Argentina in 2004. Then I became a project manager for projects in Eastern Europe, South America, and South Africa that were targeted at this kind of strata. And then I went into academia and did a master's on a kind of related subject. I think it was 2007-8. Then I started my PhD and did a PhD on that subject, and then kind of spent some years doing fieldwork and adding to the PhD, which I then kind of published. So for me, it was literally kind of 2 decades of research, and the quantitative data that I used was kind of spanned a period of 3 decades as well. So that's been a really positive experience so far, especially with regards to the publisher, who've been really good to me. With the first book, I remember that I actually, so this is 2014, but the process went back to 2011. And I remember I published it with 2 good friends, Cara and Chris, and we'd studied our masters together several years before, and we kind of stayed in touch. We kind of organised an academic network together, organised a conference together. And I think when you're thinking about doing an edited book or writing any kind of book with other people, just as you would with an academic paper, I think that relationship that's got to last for 2 or 3 years, especially with a book, of course, is a really important one. And we just had a bond of trust. We were friends, we'd go for meals together, we'd talk about each other's families, all the rest of it. And that's a really important thing, because it can, you have highs and lows, and there's tension whenever you go through that process. I'm sure we've all been there. But for me, that was one of the secrets to our success, is that we did a second edited book together as well. It was the fact that we knew each other so well. One of the difficulties of publishing that book for me personally, and it added to the stresses, was that I had just finished my PhD, was just trying to find my way in academia as a kind of permanent full-time academic, which takes a bit of time to orientate yourself around. And I also went and got married 4 times to the same woman, I should add, but just for reasons I won't go into here, twice in 2 different countries. So there were 4 weddings to plan and all that kind of thing. So it was a stressful time, okay? But it was, again, it kind of added to the rewarding element of it when it did finally get published. I think that the low point of that particular book was when we sent the proofs out, and for some reason that we can only kind of really think, still don't really know, Palgrave outsourced their proofing to India. And we got the proofs back, and the English was much worse than the English was that we'd written in our original version. And Chris Carr and I are kind of all native English speakers, and we were like, oh, this is just appalling, this can't go out. And there were mistakes all over it. So we did stress the point quite vehemently to the publisher that it was unacceptable. And in the end, I think we ended up doing our own proofreading of our own. I mean, it was just a bit of a strange situation, really. But these are some of the things, these are some of the questions. Later on, I'll go through the questions you should be asking a publisher. Just one of the things that didn't even occur to us, but that are definitely worth kind of thinking about and talking to the publisher about, what happens to the proofreading. And the third book, the monograph, I had a quite successful book launch last year, and the book was just, it it was just such a brilliant experience, and it got kind of lauded by kind of people like Paul Mason, some quite well-known academics overseas as well. You know, some quite famous people supported it and promoted it as well, which was largely because I was trying to push them to, rather than anything the publisher did. But again, I'll come to that when we come to the bit on the promotion. So, publishing a monograph, the first thing I think you need to ask yourself is it right for you? Is it the right time? Are you in the right circumstances? Because you're not necessarily going to be in the right situation personally, academically, career-wise, or whatever. So I think that's an important first question to ask. Do you have the resources available at this moment in time is another question. Time, principally, but other things too. Obviously, you know, one of the reasons we're in academia is because we want to disseminate our findings, disseminate our knowledge, add to theory, and so on, perhaps try to influence policy or decision makers and that kind of thing. So these are all good questions to be asking. You know, perhaps establishing a name for ourselves, particularly obviously if you're a PhD student or just finished a PhD rather, and you're hoping to kind of make that breakthrough and make a name for yourself. It's one of those kind of things I think probably would be a real kind of important factor to think about. In my case, as I said, it was kind of more a kind of life's work kind of thing. I just felt I had to publish it, and it was a good time as well, thinking a few years ahead also for kind of promotion. I'm not looking to get promoted at this point in time, but certainly I think, you know, for those who become associate professors or professors, you have to have had, I think, and people like Tim and Anne Will might want to correct me on this, but I would suggest you probably need to have at least one monograph, possibly other books published as well at that stage. Oh yeah, this is actually the last thing is quite an important point. When I did my PhD, it was a purely quantitative PhD, right? It was all based upon World Bank data and analysis, my own analysis, secondary analysis of and manipulation of data, of kind of data that was collected by the World Bank in about 15 years ago. But I actually wanted to really I wanted to give a voice to the voiceless, in this sense, those middle-class people who had basically become impoverished, they'd lost their businesses, lost their homes, lost their employment, and so on and so forth. In the economic crisis and the political crisis, crises actually, in Europe, in the US, in kind of the Arab Spring, all that kind of, but particularly focusing on my case study, which was up in Argentina, because it was really one of those topics that hadn't really been hugely covered, certainly not the angle that I had taken on it. So I could have just published my PhD. It would have been an easier process to follow, but instead I did 2 or 3 sets of field work, going out and interviewing my participants who originated in the World Bank data, and interviewing them 3 times over the space of a few years, and then adding that in to the mix. So on the one hand, my book was a transfer from PhD thesis into a monograph, but it was also adding in a whole new qualitative element that really did transform it quite fundamentally from what it was originally. So I've kind of straddled both those sides of the fence. You definitely need to think about these risks. Now, a funny kind of anecdote, the first thing so my supervisors were Richard Croucher, Leandro Sepulveda, and who I think we all know those two, and Sarah Bradshaw from law. And the first thing Leandro said to me, and I thought he was joking at the time, but he said, "Dan, you do realise that the divorce rate amongst PhD students is really high, don't you?" So I was like, "Oh, crikey, you know, what have I let myself in for?" I'd already signed up to do a PhD at that point. But we all know the stresses of doing a PhD and the stresses of writing a book, a particular monograph, are similar in a lot of ways, only you've also got the added complication of having most of us, unless we get kind of time off, sabbatical leave or research leave to write a book, which I didn't, I didn't apply for it, to be fair. Then we've got that added kind of problem as well of doing our regular day jobs. So the first thing I think is just to bear that in mind, right? And if you are going to publish a book, I would have a conversation with your kind of nearest and dearest, your loved ones, whether it be a partner or whoever else you live with, just to say, look, I'm going to do this. Some days I might be really stressed. There might be episodes in my life, weeks on end, where I'm just kind of burning the midnight oil really late and not sleeping very well, and I might be a bit ratty or whatever. You just need to give that understanding to those who might be directly affected. I think the second thing is, certainly this is something that Middlesex University as an institution considers, is as an opportunity cost of writing a book can sometimes be several academic peer-reviewed journal paper, academic articles. So one of the things that we inevitably have to be thinking about is the ref. And a good compromise, I would suggest, because as we know, certainly at Middlesex, monographs don't count anywhere near as much as journal articles do. A good compromise might be trying to get a couple of research papers, if you're doing it based upon research you've already done, published first, and then taking a new angle on that research and publishing it up as a monograph. That was what I did. So my first ever paper that was published was actually published in one of the most prestigious Latin American journals, the Latin American Research Review. And it was purely based upon my quantitative stuff. And then, as I said, I added all the qualitative stuff in. I'm actually still currently working on an article on some of that research, but that was taking a totally different angle to what I actually ended up publishing on, the qualitative stuff. But we can have perhaps a conversation about that later. The other thing, of course, is that research can become obsolete, or it can kind of run out of time. So you need to consider how relevant your research is going to be from the start of the publishing process, or the kind of drafting process even, all the way through to the finish line. Again, what I did was, a lot of my research was based upon kind of stuff that had happened maybe 10 years ago, but to make it relevant for the current audience, because I started this all in like 2000, the qualitative data was based, the first set of fieldwork was done in 2007, but then the second and third were during my PhD, so 2011, and then the third set was as part of the Erasmus exchange in 2018. So I had these 3 sets of qualitative fieldwork, but I had to kind of, in order to kind of pitch to a broader audience, I actually shifted the whole focus and tried to kind of, so the kind of genre or kind of lens that I was fitting my research into was kind of in line with the kind of austerity and the kind of global economic crisis. How do people recover from economic crisis in different countries, comparably? And so that all kind of happened after I'd started my PhD, 2008, but still had a lot of, it was actually even more important to look at that issue 10 years later. In Argentina, the big crisis in Argentina happened in 2001, but it was taking learning experiences from there and from places like Russia in kind of 1998 and South Africa, and experiences that predated the economic crisis, and comparing them with Greece and Spain and the US, those kinds of experiences that had happened afterwards. So just very briefly, kind of, if you are thinking about turning a PhD thesis into a monograph, I think the first rule for me was don't overplan and don't aim for perfection in the early stages. I did waste a bit of time, I think, with some publishers in the early days, first because I didn't get my monograph accepted straight away by the first publisher. I'll come on to that in a minute. But I wasted a lot of time trying to get it just right for them, a huge amount of time, when actually they weren't interested. And I realise that now, I should have realised it at the time. So we learn by doing, John Holloway, who's one of my big influences, he's an open Marxist author who's published books like Change the World. I can't remember the end of it now, but he's published several books on basically how you make change, social change from below without having a kind of bloody revolution. So how do you make small changes in the world in terms of kind of collective changes and stuff, but without kind of overthrowing the state. And he said, you know, we learn by walking, which was a phrase I think he originated from the Zapatistas in Mexico, which I think is a really interesting way of thinking about any kind of research experience. You know, we learn by asking questions, we learn by walking as we're moving through the process. So don't set your own kind of, don't put too much pressure on yourself by aiming for perfection right at the start. But you know, we learn by doing, we learn by walking, we learn by asking questions. So in terms of the differences then, so obviously with a PhD thesis, one of the things we're trying to do is demonstrate our mastery of the subject. It's a very kind of narrow and specialist audience that we're looking at, namely our PhD examiners. You know, ultimately, if you want to pass Survivor, that's who you've got in mind, even if you don't necessarily know who they're going to be. I think the difference obviously with a monograph is that you're trying to pitch to a much wider audience. You are trying to kind of have broader appeal. It's not so literature focused, you know. Obviously there are literature components to it, but in order to get that broader appeal, you know, that getting kind of, unless it's a very theoretically driven book, which it did have a kind of, you know, it used Gramscian theory and kind of offered some suggestions on Gramscian theory, but it was more, you know, researched and data driven, if you like. There is a less of it. It's more of a results focus. Okay, so those are some of the differences, but obviously there is a clear overlap between the two, the monograph and the PhD thesis. There are things that don't have to be in a book, like, for example, the review chapters, or maybe they're kind of much more condensed down versions that would appear in your book. In the book, you know, you're likely to combine chapters from your original PhD thesis. You're likely to restructure as well. And as I say, my monograph was based on my PhD, but my PhD was very much quantitative focused, but I wanted to add that richness and that readability. Actually, I wanted to pitch also to a more sociological and political science audience, and I'm not talking necessarily about the North American audiences, which tend to be much more kind of quantitative focused than, say, British and European audiences, but I did want to kind of make kind of Britain and Europe more of a kind of, I wanted to drive at that kind of audience too. So I added the kind of sociological, qualitative focuses, and also because I was focusing on very much kind of under-researched subject, you know, political responses of the newly impoverished and middle class impoverished, rather than theory testing. So it was also a bit kind of about data, kind of generating theory to some extent, and certainly inductively arriving at research kind of conclusions. I wanted to let my participants tell their story. So yeah, I added quite significantly to it. So thinking about, you know, timescales, you know, probably as a minimum from the day that you submit your draft to the publisher to publication date, probably 2 years, could be more. Maybe some colleagues have had kind of shorter experiences. I think if you go for a non-academic publisher, possibly it takes less time. Certainly if you go for one of these kind of less prestigious publishers, almost kind of, you know, I'm sure we've all received emails from a publisher claiming, saying, we're really interested in publishing your book. And then you look at the publisher's name, you've never heard of them, and there's some kind of Mickey Mouse outfit from, you know, that you're really not sure about. But they would probably publish more or less what you've written as a draft or as a PhD thesis draft and publish it. And that's fine if you just want to desperately get something out there straight away without thinking necessarily about career prospects or anything like that. But and that process can take probably a few months as opposed to a couple of years. So there's obviously, you know, the waiting time for the proposal to be reviewed. You need to set a time aside to read, edit, rewrite drafts regularly. You need to, I would suggest, block out concentrated periods of time. And I think probably we'd all agree that the way that we best sit down and write is when we've got no distractions in our life generally, or, you know, I find I'm most productive researching and writing over the summer, for instance, or, you know, that kind of thing, rather than the odd day here and there during the week. So, so moving on to kind of choosing the most appropriate publisher. Yeah, so, you know, the kind of reputation of the publisher is obviously a key thing. The more, the kind of stronger the reputation that the publisher has, the more work you're going to have to put in, the more rigorous the usually very, very good as well. There are specialist, highly specialist publishers, and those publishers that are more academic minded. There are also those publishers that are kind of a halfway house between academia and a wider audience, because they sell their publications more cheaply. So I'm thinking of kind of Pluto, Verso, Z, those kinds of ones, certainly in my field. There's practitioner-based publishers, so trade unions or NGOs. Those which are highly regarded are obviously much more likely to reject or to ask for significant improvements to drafts. The bigger ones tend to have book series as well on different subjects. So when you're thinking about publisher, don't just think about publisher, but also think about the kind of sub-series, you know, and look at those, the reputation that they have, and so on and so forth. So for example, with mine, the Palgrave one, the edited book, was published in the Studies of the America series, and the Routledge Studies one was also in Latin American politics. Now, I had quite a deep conversation with the publisher about whether it should go in the Latin American series or the International Studies series, and in the end we decided on Latin American series. I think mainly actually because I was getting on so well with the commissioning editor, and we'd already established that relationship, and I didn't want to shift over. But it certainly could have gone into international. At the end of the day, it didn't. I don't think it made too much difference in terms of who it was pitched to, because it went out in a lot of the Routledge's main kind of publicity, rather than just their specific kind of series publicity. So reach is another question. So geographical locus versus international. So, you know, obviously some publishers have quite strong outlets, or they target kind of all over the world. That was certainly a key interest of mine, was that it didn't just get kind of seen in the UK, but also further afield. So I think you also need to think about, when you're thinking about the most appropriate publisher, how fast things are moving on in your field. So if you're focusing on something that is really kind of quite time sensitive, you know, so, you know, for argument's sake, you know, if you're writing in the science field about the kind of cure for the coronavirus thing, obviously you'd need to kind of publish as soon as possible. Now, if you're a very, very world-renowned scientist in your field, you could probably go to any publisher you like. Say, look, I've got these research findings, kind of publish them. You know, presumably they'll be published in the Lancet or wherever else first. But presuming you're not, if it's a thing that needs to be published very, very quickly, we know that more prestigious publishers are going to take longer to get back to you and to decide and stuff. So it's about having that conversation if you did want to go with them and saying, look, this is really time sensitive. Can I ask you to give me an answer within the next few months if you're interested or not? If not, then I'm going to go somewhere else. And they would probably understand that if it's such a time sensitive thing, you know. Does your publisher understand the audience is another thing I think you need to ask yourself before approaching them. When you're looking at publishers, look at their track record of publishing in your area. If they've published strongly several times before in an area related to your own kind of research, then that would suggest that they probably are, and they'd understand where to pitch to and how to pitch. Ask contacts about their experiences with different publishers, particularly if you can ask them about their experiences with different publishers and specific seminar series, because you can get a big publisher who have quite a poor reputation in one seminar series but a stronger reputation in others. Upfront costs is something also that you should consider. I remember I didn't have that much upfront costs with 2 of my books, but with the Argentinian one, they wanted to, I think they asked my 2 co-editors and I for, it was something extraordinary. It was about £2,000 to kind of have the honour of publishing with them. Now, they are the #1 publisher in Latin America for academic books, but we still thought £2,000 is a lot of money. And in the end, I think we haggled it down. And it's quite customary in Latin America, actually, for publishers to pay. They weren't just trying to fleece us kind of rich British Western authors, but generally so we did kind of haggle it down. But obviously, if you haven't got any money to do that, you need to know that up front, and that's something that you should think about. Just the final thing I'd say on this part of things is that, do make that initial contact with the commissioning editor before you send in a draft or a proposal. Most of them are happy to chat because it saves them time. If it's, it saves them having to sift through your draft. They can have that conversation with you there and then on the phone and just say, yeah, it's not really for us, to be honest. So it's worth making that informal contact before submitting. Find the name, the exact person, the email, phone number of the person. Pitch your proposal best as you can to them. You can, I was going to say, every single publisher has its own process for pitching, right? So obviously the first thing you do is you look at the, some of them will say, by all means, kind of phone up the commissioning editor to have a word with them. Others will say, we don't accept phone calls, you've got to send it through on this form. Others will say, send us, they'll tell you how they want to see it. So that's an important thing, but I'll talk about that a bit more later. With my kind of monograph, I contacted Zed, first of all. I'd heard some good things about Zed. I wanted to initially pitch to an audience that wasn't just purely academic, but also because I was publishing, I was trying to give voice to the people who I mentioned earlier, but also some of the social movements and the NGOs that had been involved in the research, and I wanted that experience to be learned from as well. I didn't want to originally sell it, kind of have it just as an academic book that goes on the market for 150 quid. So I went for Zed. I think I went for Verso after that, but because Zed would have kind of published it at a kind of much more accessible price, not just to kind of universities. So I did spend about 6 months just trying to kind of go through the process with them, and I was ignored originally. Then I kind of followed up, and then I got through, and the sub-editor promised me that they'd get back to me in a certain amount of time, and they didn't. And this went on for quite a while. And in the end, I just got, after about 6 months of me kind of moaning at them, basically, they did send me back 2 lines and said, no, it just wasn't for us. And I just got really frustrated and angry. It's a bit like, I'm sure we've all had those experiences with kind of journal publications as well. But it was just like, oh, I've kind of pretty much wasted 6 months.
I can cut something out.
So just going back to the shared screen. Okay. Yeah, I think so. The kind of thing I wanted just to take from that is, yeah, look, there are Mickey Mouse publishers out there, okay? Just be careful of them. But also, you don't have to be Mickey Mouse to get some of the things wrong. I went to one of the most prestigious publishers, and we got the proofs back and they weren't very good. So, these things can happen at all levels. And in the end, it was fine and it all went out. But we had to kind of, we kind of had to scrutinize it. So writing a great proposal, look, I don't have the perfect formula. I don't have the perfect solution for doing that. We can share some experiences in a few minutes' time when I've finished. But this is generally the kind of the set of kind of things that will be requested in a proposal. And as I said, every publisher has their own format. The proposed title and length, for example, description of the book, the main thesis of the book, why you need to write a book on it, whose arguments you're using, building or refuting. The language of the proposal needs to be accessible to the commissioning editor, who may not be a field expert necessarily. In terms of content, often they want to know about kind of, will it have illustrations? Are there copyright issues involved in anything you're going to publish? The chapter outlines are a key thing, you know, to just kind of summarize the content of each chapter as a breakdown, not in a huge amount of detail, because you may not have even written the whole book draft by then, but you need to have quite an idea about how to do that, or what's going to go in. Publishers at the end of the are businesses, and they want to sell as many copies as possible to make as much profit as possible. So who will it appeal to? You know, I remember when I did mine, I tried to make the appeal seem as broad as possible. So I spoke about students, I spoke about experts, I spoke about practitioners in social movements and NGOs, I spoke about policymakers too, scholars and so on, and which countries that it would have a readership in and why. Like how would it be, why would it be relevant to kind of Latin Americans? Why would it be relevant to those of us in this country? Why would it be relevant to a European audience, a North American audience, and so on? Competing in related books, there's no point in lying, right? The publisher will know that there are probably similar books that have been written, and that's quite possible with whatever your idea is, but it's important, and this will be evident in the literature review anyway, but just explain very precisely how your book is different, what makes it different and distinct, what aspects are not covered in pre-existing books compared to your own one, what gaps are being filled, and then of course the kind of biography, just kind of pitching yourself as well. The review process, generally the review process is it's been quite similar across the 3 books that I've published. I have to say, I haven't been asked to submit a full proposal manuscript in any of them. I don't know how common that is, but what I did have to do is submit a whole proposal and book chapters, you know, kind of pretty much near finished book chapters, the introduction, the conclusion, and 1 or 2 other chapters. So that's what I did for mine. The peer review process should be constructive. It should help make the book as good as possible. You may need a second round of review depending on redrafts, and it can take many months. So even once you've kind of completed the final, what you think is the final draft that goes out to peer review, there's still usually going to be plenty of work to do after that. Make sure you demonstrate that you've understood whatever the reviewers say. I mean, I don't need to tell you this. I think everyone here's probably published peer-reviewed stuff before. So it's the kind of similar kind of principles, really. I remember when I sought advice from, I think, Richard Croucher and Leandro on the reviews, and yeah, I think you can. Basically, what I wanted to just get it published, right? I wasn't going to be very precious about what I was going to do, and I just said to Richard and Leandro, I'm not quite sure I agree with that point, and they're like, Dan, does it make or break the book for you? Yeah. Do you want to get it out as you've written it, or are you prepared to make some small changes and not? You know, I did negotiate 1 or 2 things with the reviewers, I remember, and I disagreed with them on a couple of points, but on the main substantive points, I just accepted it because I wanted to get it out. Yeah, you know, you've got to do really what you think's right. And hopefully, you know, if you pass through that whole process, you get the book contract offered to you. And signing the contract, that's up in the office up there in W124. I remember that day I was elated. I'm sure it's a bit like kind of publishing a journal article, but when it's a monograph, it's that bit more special because you've probably put even more work into it. Do read, you know, don't get carried away in the fact that they've just been offered this book contract. do read through the terms and conditions quite carefully. One thing, and do that very carefully before you sign it and send it back, because that will be your last chance to do it. Once you've signed it, you know, obviously you're legally bound. I do remember that one of the things I negotiated is the copyright for the translated version of this monograph. So I haven't done a translation yet, but I'm hopefully going to do a Spanish version at some point. And I think originally they wanted to keep the copyright, and then I said, no, I'd rather have that. And actually they gave it to me. So there are things like that that you can kind of negotiate with the publisher over. If there's anything that would limit your own ability to reuse or distribute, you know, who holds the copyright? If it's not you and the publisher are claiming it's going to be them, then that does put certain limitations on you. So just think about those first. Ask about the publisher's marketing plan. And, you know, you just need to get the kind of expectations from both parties right at this point. I've just been doing psychological contract with my students last week. So I think that kind of comes into play at all stages really, but particularly at the kind of publishing stage, this kind of signing the contract stage. So just kind of finally really, the production process. Once you're happy, sign and send it back. You will need to see the proofs obviously, and then creating an index can take some time. You can do it yourself to save money, or you can outsource it. Sometimes the publishers do it, but usually the publishers don't. Either they do it or they charge a lot of money to do it. If it's you, see if you can get a friend or family member to help with the proofreading, or use a copy editing service. Indexing can be time consuming, as can the proofreading. And we all know it's hard to proofread our own work, to be quite frank. So, and then the very last slide, promotion. So you've got your copy in your hand, you know, you're very proud of what you've produced. Now you need to go out and shout about it. And I think, you know, some basic things that are always in the guidance, you know, talk to a university library, get your own university to publicize it. I went to the PR department for Middlesex, and they pushed it on their various channels for me. Mention your book when you do conference papers. One thing I did was I drew up a short list of all the academic mailing lists I could think of, you know, JISC mail and stuff like that. And I sent it out to every single one of them. So it must have reached thousands of academics around the UK and beyond. This is something I don't think many people take the time to do, but I also compiled a list of every single Latin American studies department in the UK and North America and sent the flyer there. Now, I think I must have spent a few days doing that, but it was probably worthwhile in the end, I think, over the summer. So obviously that you can get access to pre-existing databases of these things, but I wanted a really up-to-date list, and, you know, I actually went and I did a mail merge, right? I actually found out the name of every single administrator, every single library head in all of the 100, I think in Britain there's something like 30 Latin American studies departments, maybe less. There's a lot more in the United States and so on. And I just sent them out there, and I did the same for sociology departments and stuff like that. It's worth, you know, if you've got the time, do it, or ask someone to help you do that, you know. Consider writing a piece on the main findings somewhere. So I remember I did one for the conversation for my book. I did another one in Tribune. Every time I did a media interview, I'd mention my book. So you can see, I don't know if you can quite see that, the kind of bottom thing where you can see my book. That's actually on a TV station out in Argentina. I got them to literally focus on my book when they were doing a TV interview, like a studio interview with me. Just kind of sat there, which is kind of nice. I got some good endorsements. I said Paul Mason earlier did this one. The book launches have always been quite well attended and well publicised. So that one there, again, I did in Argentina on the bottom right. Those are some of the most well-known sociologists in Argentina. There, Ezequiel Adamowski, Maristela Svampa and others, who happen to be kind of contacts or friends of mine. So I kind of offered them to come along, and they did. The one I did in the UK was at UCL, the bottom left-hand side there. Again, some quite well-known subject experts in the field kind of came along and did it. there were some quite famous people in the audience as well that day, but I'll leave that to your imagination. And then getting a journal review done, of course, is a useful thing, because that kind of, I've literally only, although this book has been out for something like a year now, they've only just started to publish the journal reviews. I think I had 3 or 4 journal review articles come out about it. Oh, I created a Facebook page as well, just to kind of get it out there a bit more on social media and stuff. So yeah, that's basically it. Kind of happy to have a discussion. If anyone's got any questions or want to share your own experiences, really happy to do that. Thanks for coming.
Thank you so much, Dan. That's been great and really interesting. Maybe you can stop your slide share. I think what I find easiest, if you guys just indicate in the chat that you want to speak, and maybe also if you want briefly indicate what you want to speak about, and that helps me to sort of steer the flow of the conversation a bit. So I'm happy for you to give your input.
I can recognize with a question, Dan, just related to my own experience. How did you deal with the title of your monograph? Is the title very close to your PhD title? Is it something different? Because when I turned my book into a monograph, they found the title quite unappealing. It was something like the Twilight of Forgeism, and they claimed it was too, you know. So it turned out to be something more sexy, but also maybe less close to what exactly was in the book. So I just wonder how you have dealt with it. Yes.
Funny enough, Nico, I had a similar experience to you, because I think originally I wanted to call it, I came up with a really kind of snazzy title that I thought would be quite appealing. I think it was based upon my PhD title. So it was Saucepans, Suits and Getting to Know the Neighbours. Then it was like, subtitle was, you know, the mobilisation of middle class revolt or something. But it was based upon the idea, you know, the saucepan protest, which is a middle class kind of protest symbol. Suits, the idea that, you know, people in suits were going out begging in places like Greece and Spain and Argentina and other places, who had just suddenly become impoverished. And then getting to know the neighbours because of all the collective responses to downward social mobility. But they didn't like it. They said, no, it's, yeah. So they came up with how about the mobilisation and demobilisation of middle class revolt? It's much more straightforward, and, you know, it won't leave people thinking it. And then, you know, you can have a more, also that they added the comparative stuff in the, because they said, look, Dan, to be honest, it's very much, it is Argentina as the case study, but you clearly, because I wanted to make, like, I've got a whole chapter in there on comparative experiences, which aren't really so data driven. It's more kind of literature based stuff on other countries. Some of it's data driven, but more through my observations of having visited different countries and looking at their experiences, or through the project management stuff that I did years ago. So they said, okay, let's do comparative insights. So they were actually really helpful with the title, but like you, they changed it. And I'm actually glad they changed it in hindsight.
Thank you. There is a question here that Runa would like to ask about choosing the right publisher. Runa, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Sorry, let me just show up. Hi.
Hi, Runa.
Thank you, Ben. Yes, I was just wondering, please, is there any service, or how do you navigate the choice of the publisher? I mean, you have provided lots of kind of inputs in this sense, and you know, it depends on the audience, it depends on essentially probably the audience, I would believe. But is there a strategy you could recommend in terms of possibly choosing the right publisher for you, or the right questions you should ask yourself, leading you to that choice? And another quick question is related to what you were talking about with Nico. How much support do you receive? I mean, besides the reviewers, yes, is there any support from the editors in terms of helping you, giving you know, the right tweak besides the title, of course, which is crucial. But maybe into like readjusting the chapters order or things like that. Thank
Yeah.
you.
So thank you, Runa. I think if anyone wants to add to what I'm about to say, please feel free, because again, this is just my own personal experience, and we've probably all, let's say, like, I know this, I'm looking at people here who have just as much, if not more, experience of me in publishing books and other things. So in terms of the kind of support from the editor, the kind of editor, the relationship that I developed with the editor of the monograph was pretty much as a kind of advisor, actually. I mean, she always let me have the final say, but I would be asking her constantly, you know, what's worked previously. What do you think about me moving, you know, you said, for example, the order of chapters. What do you think about me doing this chapter here, or kind of shifting that around slightly? And she just kind of said, yeah, you know, I've obviously, in my experience of having done this before, I would suggest this, that, and the other. And 9 times out of 10, I'd kind of go with her. But I think the key to kind of using a commissioner editor is really the relationship you can build up with them. So I had the closest relationship of the 3 with the most recent one, which is the monograph. And I remember we had like a Zoom, because she was based in the States, although the publisher was kind of based here. We just clicked on Zoom. We had we didn't just speak about publishing, we spoke a bit about life and, you know, whatever it happened to be. You know, we both got an interest in Latin America and stuff like that. And because we kind of established that bond at the start, I think that helped to carry us through as well. And it meant that really no question for me was too silly to ask her, you know, and we had that kind of mutual respect. What was the first thing you asked? Sorry, I've forgotten.
Thank you. So it's good to know you do actually establish an ongoing relationship with your editor, right?
Definitely, yeah.
Good. The first question was about any tips on how to choose the right publisher.
Yeah.
Besides the audience, how to have in mind the audience, and I don't know, in terms of both being academic and not, and being international or not. I mean, besides those 2 factors, which are crucial, do you have any other suggestions?
So, I mean, in my case, it was really, for the monograph in particular, it was kind of the key thing for me was kind of targeting a mass audience. That was actually the first thing I wanted it to be. Mm-hmm. Now, I went to Z, which have as I said, the books are usually more accessible.
Yeah.
Had a bad experience with them. Then I think I tried, it was either Versa or Pluto, I can't remember now. Mm-hmm. Same thing. So I was starting to get the message that for whatever reason, maybe I was pitching it in a too academic way. I don't know, because the feedback was quite poor. So I thought, right, I've got to really now go for a kind of top academic publisher, and then hope that the paperback will come out eventually. Funny enough, the paperback is coming out next month. This month, in 2 weeks' time. I think it's something like a quarter, maybe even a fifth of the price of the hard copy. So that was something really important for me when I eventually did go to Routledge. And again, for me, it was in terms of kind of, I was thinking of the top kind of publishers in kind of that would be interested in my field, but also interested in something that had a kind of Latin American kind of focus. And really it had to be Palgrave Macmillan, with whom I'd already published, and I wanted to get experience of a different publisher, probably Cambridge and Routledge. And I think I did consider Cambridge, but then in the end I just I can't remember if I applied to Cambridge now or not. I don't think I did in the end. I think I thought about it quite hard and just went for Routledge. So yeah, I think it's just a question of, you know, prioritizing what your key drivers are, and then asking yourself those questions in terms of the publisher, and then just going with what feels right for you, but then picking up on the signals that you're getting back depending on what happens. But yeah, does anyone else want to add to that, to Runa's question?
Nico, can you share your experience about choosing publisher?
Well, yes, so it was a similar experience of trying the different routes, but eventually the way I went through, the route I chose was through the series editors. So I found that when the series editors are credible, then that gives also obviously a lot of credibility to your own book. So I eventually made a choice for Palgrave because the series editors were really famous academics in my field.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience?
I'm just reading through the chat comments.
Yeah, the chat has been very lively, really interesting, actually.
Nico made a joke about 4 weddings in a book launch. I don't quite mean when I this is totally nothing to do with publishing, but when I did get married 4 times in 2 different countries for the same woman, I remember people did say, "Oh yeah, 4 weddings and a funeral, ha ha ha." And then I remember we got back from our honeymoon, which is, I think it was in I say I think because we had 2 sets. We had a UK based honeymoon, and then we had a honeymoon in Cuba the next year. We did get back from the honeymoon in Cuba, I think it was, which was December, and literally my great aunt passed away the day we got back, so there was literally a funeral to attend as well within the next few days. So there was literally 4 weddings and a funeral, so and a book and several book launches. But yeah.
Dan, can I ask you a question, which is not entirely like directly related to books, but to the topic of your books? I know you are a London boy, or like an English boy. How did you establish your links with, or your interest in South America?
Yeah, I mean, depending on who I talk to, I'm either an Essex boy or an East London boy, because I come from Ilford, which is on the border, and there's a big debate about whether we belong to Essex or we're a London borough, but we've also got Essex in our postal address. But yeah, well, that's interesting. No, I originally got interested in Latin America because I went to, I just finished my degree at UCL, and I think I just wanted to do something a bit different before starting a job. And actually my degree was in European social and political science, so it was actually very much driven to Europe. And I think originally I wanted to work in the European Union. This is obviously going back quite some time. And so I'd learned Spanish as part of my degree and also at school. And I remember I was living with my grandma actually just after I finished university. Didn't have a job, I was living with my grandma. Life was pretty glum. And I remember she said to me, Dan, I'm just reading the newspaper that there's a volunteer opportunity to go and volunteer in Argentina. Was a volunteer had dropped out for this certain volunteer program that was being advertised. And I'd applied, and within a week they'd accepted me, and I was on the plane out to Argentina. And I went out there as a volunteer for 6 months, worked in some of the shanty towns, but also with people who had gone through the process of middle-class people who had gone through the process of downward social mobility and impoverishment. Met my wife out there. She later became my wife, to whom I married 4 times. Then when I came back to the UK, the NGO that I'd gone out and worked for offered me a full-time job, which I took, and then that set me on the path towards working in NGOs, which I did for the next few years. And then I developed a real academic interest in this whole question. So that was when I decided to kind of do a PhD, and then, you know, the rest of the story. So it's funny how these, you know, just for my gran happened to see that advert in that newspaper that time, my whole life kind of changed.
Yeah.
Kind of sliding doors moment. That it's funny.
It's really interesting. Thank you. Do we have any more questions from the audience?
No, I just have a little comment. It's more of a rant against academic publishing in general, because so I published 2 books overall, and the second one was fairly successful for the type of book it was, but the contracts of academic publishers are so tight that it means that you hardly see any royalty for that. And now it must seem a very a very petty complaint. But eventually, when you wonder, like, why am I doing all this? I don't get anything. And so just as a warning, that nowadays a lot of publishers give you standard royalties for the print copy, but they have a different system for the electronic copy or ebooks. And the truth is that most of the books are now sold in ebook format for a lot of academic books. Mm. So just have an eye on that aspect too, because that experience has completely changed my outlook now in terms of academic publishing, because my non-academic friends were asking me, oh, we publish a book, so now you're earning money. But I think it's fair to be compensated, and it's fair also to push for the whole culture of academic publishing to change in terms of how authors are compensated. So as part of kind of wider battle, it's an aspect that I'm interested in kind of being careful to follow up in the future.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good point, Nika, that I didn't mention myself. If clearly, when you're thinking about motivations, making money from academic books isn't one of them, unless you're kind of Noam Chomsky type figure, of course. But I think I remember for the Palgrave one, I think I was on about 20p per book, and that was like the three of us who were editors, so we got like 60p per book, and we got our first commission through. And it was literally like, this is after a year, and it was like enough for us to have a meal. It was enough to have a meal together, I think, or something like that. And then we got another, because we're still getting the commission through, still selling the odd copy here and there. And it was literally about 50p or something like that. Yeah, clearly. But I suppose the difference is between electronic and print copies. I mean, I would guess that commission for these books, that, by the way, this book is selling at, I think it's 120 quid, right? And the paperback copy is selling at about 30, which is much more reasonable, but still it's, anyone outside academia would still probably struggle to pay 30 quid for a book. But I think the difference between print and electronic is probably so little. You might get 30, 40p per copy from one and maybe 10 for another or something, but yeah, it's self-exploitation, frankly. It's exploitation by the publisher, super exploitation, as Marx would call it. But it's self-exploitation, I think, to some extent, because we're very conscious about what we're subjecting ourselves to. And we're doing it for the prestige, usually, and for the career progression, kind of those kind of opportunities. So, yeah, my wife always takes the mick out of me and says, can you invite me out on all the commission that you've made to a meal this evening or something? And I'm like, well, we'll end up cooking at home then, kind of thing. But yeah. Were there any questions in the chat that haven't been covered?
No. The questions that people wanted to ask, they did get to ask.
Cool.
Any now sort of final opportunity? Any other questions? Any final questions, comments? Yeah, I can. What I can only say is that I've seen a colleague going through the process, and it is if you are with an established, or you choose an established a prestigious publisher, it's several rounds of engagement, isn't it, before you get the green light, and it's quite rigorous. But yeah, just maybe a question into the audience. Are you feeling encouraged to write a book now, or are you feeling put off, or what's the sort of view? I haven't set up a poll for this, so I can't run a poll on this, but maybe anyone. As fearful and worried as before. Yeah, I think also, I guess there are also different types of academics. I mean, I personally, I don't think that's very high up on the list of priorities to write a book. Some people just enjoy writing shorter pieces like journal articles or blog posts or reports. But I think obviously, I think it gives you a lot of satisfaction if you have a book with your name in the book.
Can I just add one thing to that? I can see that most people are not kind of really keen to embark on this, and I agree it's a really time-consuming process. But there is a kind of a middle option in terms of co-authoring a research monograph with others, and if you can get along with your co-authors, that can be a really nice process. I've done one book like this, which was with two of my PhD students, because we identified a topic that we all had worked on. So they were able to kind of embellish and recycle part of their PhD material by repackaging it, and I was able to publish a chapter on data that I'd never been able to publish in an article format. So in that sense, you can do it quicker. But you really need to find people who work on similar topics, and that can be quite hard, and you need to know that you can work with these people. So ideally, these need to be people that you've known for a long time, because otherwise it's just additional stress.
What I've done recently, and this is I was basically on the other end. I was commissioned to write a chapter in an edited book, and I thought this was really quite a nice experience to actually be asked by someone and to actually be able to I had data which I had collected and I hadn't used, so a bit like Anna will, and to actually do a really interesting chapter that I wouldn't have been able to publish in a journal. So that was actually quite nice. I guess that's also a nice way to publish a book, isn't it? If you commission then the chapters out to other people.
Yeah, we could probably do a whole talk about doing kind of edited volumes, edited books, and the issues of trying to kind of manage relationships with every single chapter author, or, you know, if you've done a special edition of a journal article, I suppose it's the same kind of thing. I mean, we had one horror experience from there was we actually, for the first book, we actually had someone who was with us who was going to write a really interesting book chapter, and we sent it out to review. And the external reviewer said, this guy's basically plagiarized my research. And he showed us. And yeah, it was just extraordinary. So we obviously didn't let that individual print his stuff with our book, but it was just, yeah, it was awkward to say the least.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Anyway, any final comments? Otherwise, I would thank you a lot for coming. We're gonna take a break now from MLO seminars, but we are back in January, and with the help of Anna Will, I have been able to put together a really interesting seminar program for the second term. So just in January, we have a reader from Brunel University, Dr. Rossi, who she will talk about, along with a colleague in Leeds, about sort of engaging with practitioners on your research. And then we have, for the second talk, which I think is on the 27th of January, Sarah Dodds. I think she used to be at Middlesex. She's going to do an interesting piece on repositioning entrepreneurship. So these are the two things to look forward to in January, but then obviously I will keep populating your calendars with these interesting seminars, and I hope you come along. But that was really enjoyable. I will see if I can share the recording today, and then maybe it might be also interesting, Nico, for the PhD students, right? To listen to.
Yeah, I was thinking that to talk to Dan to kind of repurpose this for PhDs. But I was mentioning in the chat that we have a session of research cafes with the students and staff. So if anybody wants to join before the Christmas break, just to say, you know, Happy Christmas, then you know, you're welcome to join, and it would be nice.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, and I wish you a good rest of today, and thank you for Dan for sharing. And it's been really fascinating to listen to.
Thanks everyone for coming. Thank you.
And yeah, I will see you guys around. Thank you so much. Thanks again.